So we have enzymes that are involved in regulating our vitamin D levels. And we also have something up here called vitamin D binding protein, which acts like a chaperone protein. It transports it throughout the body. And as long as it's bound to this protein, it's not bioactive. So it has to be free to actually be bioactive. And then down here, we have something called a vitamin D receptor. And that's how the bioactive vitamin D binds to this receptor. It actually acts like a transcription factor. As Bonnie was saying, it's responsible for inducing hundreds, perhaps even up to 1,000 different genes, and many of those are immune related. So if you look at each of these individual enzymes or the binding protein or the vitamin D receptor, they're all what we say polymorphic. There are genetic variants that will affect how well they bind to vitamin D, how well they metabolize vitamin D, how well they transport vitamin D. So we say that this is like a polygenic trait. There would be small contributions from each of these genes that would influence your risk of being vitamin D deficient. Okay,
And the
unshare
only
that.
thing, yeah, I don't know if you have any other slides there, Neil, you want to share.
Yeah.
Um, but maybe for your audience, it's important for them to understand, a polygenic trait versus a monogenic trait. So when it comes to disease resistance, for example, or vitamin D, like Neil said, many genes control these traits, thousands. Whereas, let's say if we think about how tall we are, then there's only one gene, and you're either homozygous or heterozygous, dominant, recessive. It's fairly simple. But when you're dealing with thousands of genes, now it's how all of those genes are orchestrated together. It's quite mind blowing. So there are certain strategies that researchers use to look at these so-called complex traits when they're controlled by many genes. They're called complex traits, to try and get a handle on them, because it's not like just looking at height or weight or eye color. It's much more challenging than that. Now, not all of the genes will make the same contribution. So let's say we have 1,000 genes. It does not mean that each of those 1,000 genes makes the exact same contribution. Some will contribute more to, let's say, the variation in vitamin D. Some will contribute less. The ones that contribute more, if there are one or two of those that have a major impact, we call them major genes. Now, when we think about vitamin D, right now the literature is showing there's a couple of genes to focus on when we're talking about that, and that's the vitamin D receptor, that's those enzymes, and probably the vitamin D binding protein.
The genes would encode, like they're the recipe to make these proteins. And if you look at the sequence of that gene, we all have those genes. But if you look at the sequence, the nucleic acid sequence is different from person to person. And sometimes that has no effect, but other times it might be in a region where it's involved in enhancing the expression of the gene. So if we have a genetic variant in there, that could mean that some people are producing lots of that gene, could be vitamin D receptor. Other people are not producing lots of it. And if we were talking about enzymes, there could be what Bonnie was saying, a single nucleotide polymorphism that influences the activity level or how well that enzyme can actually metabolize vitamin D.